Welcome to the next session, Climate-Informed Forest Restoration and Management. My name is Craig Highfield. I'm with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. I also have Marissa Spratley, also with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, who will be running the webinar behind the scenes. First, we want to go over some housekeeping items. So Marissa, can you take me to the next slide? This session will, like others, will be recorded and made available at a later date. All attendees will be muted unless you're speaking. Please use the chat box feature if you have any questions throughout the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a message in the chat box to me and Marissa, and we'll do our best to help you out. Lastly, the rest of the forum schedule can be found on sketch.com. I'll copy and paste a link in the chat box for your convenience. And remember, you can have all sessions you add to your Sketch itinerary directly added to your Outlook, Google, or Apple Calendar. Okay, next slide. Just to introduce our speakers today, we have Katie Brownson, who's a watershed specialist for the U.S. Forest Service, Danielle Shannon, Northern Forest Climate Hub Coordinator for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and Hairston-Strang, Associate Director of the Maryland Forest Service. Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Craig, and thanks so much for everyone for joining us today. So to get us started, we'd like to get to know you all a little better. We're going to be sharing a lot of information today, but we also really want to be learning from you about your experiences and perceptions. So we're hoping that everyone is super energized after lunch and ready to engage. So we have a couple quick polling questions here. You could pull up, please. Perfect. Just give you a couple more seconds to answer these questions. So we want to know what type of organization you work for. If you work for an other not listed here, please just go ahead and throw that in the chat. And then also classify your current level of knowledge about forest restoration and management with respect to climate change. All right, let's go ahead and show the results. All right, so we got a lot of nonprofit representation. That's great. Pretty good among some of the others. Local, state, federal, private sector. Yeah, curious about you other folks. So please do put in where you work in the chat. That'd be great. And then in terms of current knowledge, we're at, most of you have some basic awareness. 0 experts. I have a hard time believing that, but I think we just have a humble audience today. But a lot of people are knowledgeable. Some folks just starting to learn. Don't think we have anyone that doesn't know what climate change is, so that's great. All right, next slide, please. All right, so before we get into the content that we're hoping to share with you today, we wanted to hear a little bit more from you all about what your concerns are specifically around the impacts that climate change is having on Chesapeake forests. So I believe Craig or Marissa is going to put the link to Slido in the chat, or you can just go to slido.com here, and this is the meeting code. And if you want to stop sharing, Marissa, I can go ahead and share my screen so we can look at the results as they come in. So as you're thinking about factors that might be concerning for you all in terms of the impacts, you can think pretty broadly. Thinking about things that are, ecological changes that you've observed, impacts that have kind of trickled down to your community, or social political considerations. But yeah, we're interested to hear about what your concerns are here. All right, good. So it should hopefully make us a pretty word cloud if all goes according to plan. All right, plant selection seems to be the key one there. So something about how different climate, we're getting different plants that are doing better than others. Concern about tree death, warmer winters, loss of tree canopy. Great. Runoff. Water quality. Concerns about diversity loss. I'll just do a few more seconds on this one. Threat of pests. It's good. Economic impacts. Yeah. So sea level rise. It's a good one. Yeah. Great. Well, yeah, thank you all for participating in this. This is great. Get a better perspective on what some of your concerns are. I'm going to go ahead and preview another question that we're going to ask you at the end of the presentation today, just to kind of wet the whistle a little bit. So at the end, we're hoping to have a little discussion on what you all see as the most important ways forest restoration or management can help improve the resilience of ecosystems and communities to climate change. This is a pretty big and loaded question, and you don't have to put in an answer now, but we just wanted to get the wheels spinning a little bit. And we will leave this open, so if things come up as you're listening to our presentation and you want to go ahead and throw them in here, please feel free to do that, or you can just leave it open and we can come back at the end and put some things in there. All right, so I see some things coming in already.
Yeah, so the big question will be at the end at 2 o'clock. We'll be able to come back to that.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Craig. So I need to get back into Zoom here and figure out how to stop sharing my screen. And then we're going to go back to the presentation for now. Great. All right, so a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to have 3 presentations in this session. The first one is going to be on climate change and the Chesapeake Forest Restoration Strategy, which I'm going to be covering. And Danielle Shannon is going to be talking about responding to climate change in forest and watershed management. And then Hairston-Strang is going to finish us off with some kind of more on the ground examples from Maryland of climate-wise forestry. I know Craig did mention to put questions in the chat. If it is possible to use the Q&A pod, that would be great, because we are going to ask some questions in the chat as we go along. I don't want your questions to get lost. So feel free to use the Q&A pod as well, and we'll try to monitor questions in there as we go. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll jump right in here. Next slide. So I wanted to start with a little background on the restoration strategy itself. The original strategy was completed back in 2012. Some of you might be familiar with it. We started revising the strategy about a year ago with the encouragement of Maryland State Forester at the time, Don Van Hassen. The strategy was developed with input from an advisory committee that included 22 people, including representatives of all the jurisdictions in the watershed, multiple federal agency partners, including EPA, NRCS, Fish and Wildlife, as well as partner NGOs like the Alliance here. So it was a really great collaborative effort, and it is in the very final stages of layout right now. It's been a bit of a process, but it should be available any day now, hopefully within the next week or two. The strategy was also the basis for sorry, go back real quick. Back, perfect, thank you. The strategy was also the basis for a shared stewardship agreement, which was signed just a couple weeks ago virtually with the Chief of the Forest Service, Vicki Christensen, and all of the state foresters in the watershed. And for those of you that aren't familiar with shared stewardship, it's a little jargony, but it's basically a relatively new USDA initiative to encourage the states and the federal government to work together more strategically to address management challenges at scale across ownership boundaries. Obviously, the Chesapeake is really no stranger to doing that sort of work, but it was a good opportunity to kind of take a step back and think about how we can work together more strategically to restore forests across the watershed. The new version of the strategy includes a lot of updates, but most relevant for today, we added an entire new section all on forest restoration and climate change. Next slide, please. So this section of the strategy is organized around 4 primary themes, which is kind of how I'm going to organize my talk today too. We're going to cover some highlights from this section of the strategy in terms of the types of impacts climate change might be having on forests now and in the future, the role that forests can play in climate change mitigation, the role forests and forest restoration can play in climate change adaptation, and then some strategies for planning more resilient forest restoration projects. So next slide, please. All right, so before we describe some of the trends that we summarize in the strategy, we want to hear again from you a little bit more about some of your observations on the ways that climate change is already impacting some of the forests that you work or play in. You know, you think about forests, I encourage you to take a pretty broad definition. You know, this doesn't have to be, you know, a big wilderness area that you escape to. It could just be the little patch of trees in your neighborhood or in your city. But we're curious to hear about some of the impacts that you've already observed in the forest that you interact with. I'll give just a couple seconds here to respond to this. We see some death of white oaks, ghost forests, so coastal areas, concern about birds. Ooh, baby beaches galore. Nice one. Invasives and forest fires, disease and pests, reducing biodiversity. That's great. More invasive species, more disturbances. A lot of invasive species. Yeah, it's very visible. More precipitation, hydrological changes. Great. We'll go to the next slide, please. But y'all can keep adding in here. We'll keep the chat. So a lot of this, you know, aligns pretty well with some of the things that, you know, we'd expect with a changing climate. You know, the general climate change projections for this region are that it will get hotter. There's going to be greater extremes in precipitation. So the question is, what might this mean for our forests? So these predictions that we summarize in the strategy are based on a forest vulnerability assessment for the Mid-Atlantic that are done by some of our NIACS and US Forest Service colleagues. And of course, there's always uncertainty and there's going to be variability from place to place, but thinking broadly, these are some of the changes that science tells us that we might expect in this watershed. The changes in climate might mean that conditions may no longer be suitable for some of the species in our forest currently, so there might be changes in species composition. With generally hotter temperatures, we may have longer growing seasons. With increased extremes in precipitation, we might expect both increased flooding impacts and increased risk of drought or moisture stress, so a lot more variability. And that moisture stress may be a particular risk in the context of late season flash droughts like we saw last year, which may in turn increase wildfire risk. We're seeing that conditions may be improving for insects, pathogens, invasive species, as many of you all were pointing out, so that might be posing increased risk for forests. And in coastal areas, we're anticipating increased impacts from sea level rise, both in terms of the negative impacts of saltwater, but also as the sea level rises, the freshwater table can get driven up, which can increase freshwater inundation, and that can have negative impacts too. So there's a lot of alignment, I think, between, you know, what we'd expect and some of the things you all are observing, which is great. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of forest and climate change mitigation, currently it's estimated that watershed-wide, this is based on FIA data from the Forest Service, by the way, it's that Chesapeake forests are storing 1.9 billion short tons of carbon, both above and below ground, so in multiple carbon pools. with the majority of that carbon storage occurring on private lands, which really highlights the importance of working with private landowners to ensure that these forests stay forests and that this carbon is retained. And although mitigation and conservation isn't really the focus of our session today, I think it's important to acknowledge that forest restoration and management, or lack thereof, can have really big implications for carbon storage. And both reforestation and forest management practices, things like extending timber harvest cycles, can increase long-term carbon storage. Next slide, please. So I want to go over some of the ways that we highlight that forests can help adapt to some of the projected changes in climate. So in terms of benefits for projected increases in rainfall, like we're seeing today in many places, there are multiple ways that forest restoration can help mitigate flooding. So increasing forest cover can increase infiltration and evapotranspiration, which reduces the total amount of water that moves downstream during floods. Modeling has also shown that restoring riparian areas in middle and upper subbasins can help desynchronize downstream flood peaks, which basically means that the big pulses of water from all the different subbasins aren't coming down all at the same time. So that combined flood peak downstream will be lower if things aren't all happening at the same time, if the peaks aren't all coming down at the same time. Forest restoration can also help control soil erosion and reduce stream sedimentation, which has important benefits for habitat in the stream as well as water quality. In terms of the benefits for projected increases in temperature, restoring our riparian forests can be really important for cooling our streams, benefiting species like brook trout that require a cooler stream environment. Also cooling our urban environment and mitigating some of those urban heat island impacts. And restoring forests can also help improve soil moisture retention, which may help counteract some of the influences of drought. Next slide, please. So we've gone through some of the ways that forest restoration and management can help us adapt to climate change and mitigate future climate change. So now I'm going to spend a little time discussing some strategies and considerations for designing forest restoration projects to be more resilient to climate change. Of course, need to emphasize that there's not a one-size-fits-all prescription for how to adapt to climate change, but we do kind of go over some key considerations in the strategy. And one of these is really thinking through what tree species are likely to do well under future climate regimes. So this table is based on a customized set of projections that Forest Service scientists did for us for 4 physiographic regions within the watershed, which is based on some modeling and some tree atlas projections. The methods are all detailed in this paper from last year. And if you want to nerd out on the modeling, which is really cool, I'd recommend checking that out. Let me know if you want a copy. But this approach is designed to provide guidance to forest managers regarding how tree species and forest communities might change over the next century. These are really broad brush projections for species that did favorably or unfavorably in at least 2 physiographic regions in the watershed. So if you want more detail, we're happy to provide the tables we have for each physiographic region, which will provide a bit more detailed perspective. We also really want to note that these changes will be gradual. So we don't expect these loser species to start dying off, but the projections are that conditions will generally become less favorable for them to be established over time. Also wanted to highlight that some species native to the southeast, like longleaf pine, are likely to migrate into the region within the next century. And so species like that may even be candidates for careful assisted migration. Next slide, please. All right, so in addition to thinking about the species of trees, it may also be worth considering the genetics of the trees that you're using. So selecting, you may want to select for resilience to projected changes in climate, or individuals that are resilient to other environmental shifts, such as increases in invasive species or pest disease. There's this cool seedlot selection tool, which I linked to in the presentation there, which is a GIS tool that matches your desired planting area with potential seed source areas based on climate projections that you can customize. So if you want to get individuals that are well adapted to what the climate may be like at a certain point in the future, you can use this tool to identify places where you may want to source seeds or seedlings. I imagine some of you were in the stormwater session earlier, but with changes in rainfall intensity, duration, and volume, there may need to be changes in specs for BMPs, you know, that are related to forest restoration and tree planting. With seasonal shifts, the ideal planting window may move earlier over time, which is something just to pay attention to. The increased invasive species pressure may require additional investments and maintenance to ensure trees can get established. And in terms of environmental justice, I think it's important to recognize that some groups, particularly low-income populations and communities of color, tend to be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than others. And so it's really important to think about who's benefiting from the restoration projects we're putting in. We know heat's a particular issue, with these communities often being located in places with less tree canopy. And for more on that, I hope that you'll join the panel tomorrow, which is at 12:30 on heat, health, and trees. And then finally, partnerships are super important. We know climate change is an urgent threat. Restoring forests is a key strategy we can use to make our ecosystems and communities more resilient. We're lucky in the Chesapeake that we already have really strong partnerships across the watershed. So we need to make sure that we're leveraging these partnerships to take a strategic and coordinated approach to restoring forests across the landscape. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm curious to hear from you all again who are out in the trenches, if you are already adjusting the way you work as a result of climate change. I think we're going to pull up a quick Zoom poll question here. So just indicate, if you have changed the way you work, if you haven't, or if this question just isn't applicable to you, if you're not actively involved. And for those of you that are actively involved and you have changed the way you work, if you could put in the chat maybe an example of how you've changed the way you work, or more details on kind of just in general how you've changed the way you work, to give us a better idea of what adjustments are already being made. Let's go ahead and throw up the results for that. All right. So a lot of you aren't actively involved, which is totally fine. We're all here to learn. A few of you, only 5 of you said you have. So those 5 of you, we're going to be counting on you to put in some examples and information about how you've adjusted the way you work as a result of climate change in the chat for us. Next slide, please. So I think that's all I have for today. And I believe I'm about at the end of my allotted time, but I might have time for 1 or 2 questions. Craig, I'll leave that up to you.
Okay. So the one question that came in, it's a big question. We may not have the 1 minute to do it, but how can a private landowner farmer learn more about carbon storage and how to take advantage of selling carbon offsets?
Oh yeah, that is a big question, Craig. That's a good one for you, actually.
Yeah, maybe we can address that towards the end, because we have been hearing a lot about carbon markets and the voluntary market as well. And there could be opportunities in a voluntary market, but we'll maybe discuss at the end. So I do want to transition into Danielle for her presentation next. Thanks.
Yeah, and I can throw some resources in the chat on that too. Maybe I know there's some new developments on kind of trying to make carbon markets more accessible for smaller landowners, which has been kind of one of the big challenges in this watershed. So thanks for that question.
There are some responses in the Q&A from
Great.
Danielle and me.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, thank you, Katie. Thank you, Anne. All right. Hello, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We've got a pretty packed room, even though it doesn't feel like it because we're virtual, but we do, and we really appreciate your time coming to today's session. So my name is Danielle Shannon, and I am the coordinator of the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and a specialist at NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. Today, I'm going to kind of take a step back and talk to you about some of these broad ideas that are related to climate change and climate adaptation responses and tools that you can use to integrate all these ideas into site level project planning. And for all of you who said that you're not necessarily in the forest restoration or integrated into the forest specific fields, what I'm going to talk about today should be applicable to you. Just forgive all the times that I say the word forest. Okay, next slide. So just to give you a little background on my organization, I am one of a team of several climate adaptation specialists and researchers at an organization called NIAX. Our organization is led by the Forest Service and funded by the Forest Service primarily. Our steering committee, though, includes a whole bunch of other perspectives and ideas from indigenous groups, nonprofits, forest industry, and academic groups. So if I had to sum up our work, the take-home message is probably that the work that I do and others in NIAX like me, the work that we try to do is provide practical information and resources and technical assistance that help to bring home this idea of climate change and its effects on forests and other ecosystems. Okay, next slide. So, we know that the climate is changing and we know it is affecting our forests. And thanks to Katie for that great introduction to these ideas and concepts. At my organization, NIAX, we've been thinking about this issue for quite a while and actually have a project called the Climate Change Response Framework. This is a pretty big project where we work with regional partners to provide an integrated set of tools and partnerships and actions that can help to support climate-informed conservation and management. In this region, my colleague Patricia Leopold, who can't be here today because she's caring for her brand new little one, so I'm stepping in for her. She is the lead of the Mid-Atlantic Climate Change Response Framework and has worked with local partners like Anne and Katie from within Maryland and beyond to assess forest change using the best available science and models. And through this collaborative effort, we've actually produced a forest vulnerability assessment report. And so you can find it at that URL on the bottom of the screen, forestadaptation.org/Mid-Atlantic. The report is awesome. It's huge, so you got to take some time to read it. But the whole point of it was to pull together a great synthesis of historical and future projected climate conditions, data, models, narrative on how a changing climate may actually affect the forests in the region. We do stop short of making recommendations because this report is meant to just be a starting place to understand how the climate has changed and how an increase in stressors and climate drivers may increase the vulnerability of Maryland forests. So again, check it out at the slide at the URL below. Next slide, please. So from this work, we've produced a growing number of tools and resources that help to tell the story of forest vulnerability from climate change. We've created not only a massive report, but broken that down into smaller recorded presentations that you can access, story maps, projected tree species model results in like a 2-page printable document. We have adaptation tools and even help to tell real world stories of how managers have considered climate change in their work. So you can check all of that out on our website. Again, same link, forestadaptation.org/Mid-Atlantic. Next slide. So that was a snapshot of some of the climate change resources that we have prepared for the region. But I want to take a minute to pause and ask all of you, what tools are you using to help think about climate change in your work? Think about it and provide a few of those resources in the chat box so that we can all learn from each other. And I'll give you a minute to think about that, and I will paste the link to our assessment into the chat as well. iTree, yeah, that is a fabulous tool. Thanks for the link to that, Jared. Very cool. I see lots of great ideas coming in. Yeah, if you have a link or an idea, definitely put it in there. I'll let folks continue to add those ideas. Maybe we'll just move on. Okay, cool. Oh, that'll be a fun one to check out, flood factor. All right, next slide, please. So the big question is, can we actively respond to and prepare ecosystems to cope with climate change? Like, can we even do that? Is that too big of a challenge? Are we even well poised to do this? You know, not only do we want to respond and prepare those ecosystems for change, but can we do it and maintain the trajectory of meeting our goals and objectives, maintaining those functional traits that we want our watershed to have? You know, how do we respond? Well, the answer is it depends. And that's like cue the sad music, right? Like, wah, wah. The reality is that all lands are affected by climate change, but not all lands will respond in the same way. And, you know, the outcomes and options that we have available to us really depends on where you're working, you know, what those baseline conditions are, what your adaptive capacity is, and what you're trying to achieve. Great, next slide. But we do have options. You know, we can adapt. An adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation or in response to climate change. So keep in mind, adaptation actions are designed to address climate-related risks while still meeting our goals and objectives. Next slide. Climate-informed actions may not always look new, wild, or different. In fact, many adaptation actions will be consistent with and even underscore the importance of sustainable practices and BMPs that we're already used to using to restore ecosystem function. Next slide. In fact, there really is a whole continuum of adaptation options that are out there for us. I think most of us are really familiar with that middle one, resilience, but I want to point out that there is a continuum of responses that will vary widely one from the other, from actions that can reduce impacts to retain current conditions, functions, and traits, all the way to actions that can help us manage the system for change and really are more forward-looking. You know, these are the basic concepts that we have at hand. And I just want to make it clear that, you know, there is more than one option, but also these ideas are super fuzzy. So you may find yourself anywhere on this continuum. You don't have to fit into any one of these boxes right from the get-go. Okay, next slide. But in the end, the actions that we will choose to make given climate change risks are anchored in our own values and our own willingness to accept risks. So, you know, there is no right way to pursue climate adaptation, but unfortunately, there is no easy button either. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about making a plan. Some of you are like, but wait, what is adaptation planning? So, you know, I just want to recognize that there are a lot of ideas and tools floating around out there related to adaptation planning. To us in my organization, we define adaptation planning as when land managers explicitly and intentionally identify an adaptation pathway that meets their goals and their objectives. So the key idea here is to be intentional. Some folks out there think that what they're doing is perfectly suitable to address climate change risks and say so without actually thinking it through. So it's that thinking it through part and making it those clear connections that can open up unseen risks and even potential opportunities that we can capitalize off of. So, you know, what we do is we integrate the best available climate change data and information into our planning so that, you know, we can make climate informed decisions to reach that end goal. Even if the end result isn't exactly what we originally conceived, we're still getting in that direction of, you know, functional restoration, let's say. Okay, next slide. Okay, so it's time to be intentional. You're ready to move on from those big ideas of adaptation concepts to something that's more practical and reasonable for the places that you're working in. Well, what are you going to do? Start by making an adaptation plan. And I would offer that you should check out our tool that we've created called the Adaptation Workbook. And the Adaptation Workbook is a resource that, well, we have an adaptation toolkit that helps managers integrate climate considerations into their planning. So there's a framework, an adaptive management process, and a decision support tool in the form of a workbook and related resources. And I'll talk about a little of those in the next slides. The workbook was designed to be flexible, to accommodate diverse goals, ownership, and even different ecosystems. But most typically it is used at the project level planning. And that's because we want it to focus and center on the manager's expertise and judgment. Like, we're not going to spoon feed you all the answers. We want you to use your own brain. So you can download the tool at the bottom of the screen or even use the online version. Okay, next slide. So, the components of the Adaptation Workbook, it's really no mystery. It's no black box. It's just an adaptive management process that's adapted for climate change. The framework steps people through a logical process and a framework to articulate and account for goals and perspectives, potential climate change risks, and identification of actions that can enable the ecosystem to cope with stressors and adapt to changing conditions, while also addressing and promoting this idea of monitoring. We need to go back and we need to check in and reflect on the overall effectiveness of our actions. The workbook is meant and designed to allow for critique of your thoughts along the way. You can scribble, you can erase, but the whole thing is meant to be a clear and transparent way to connect the dots between climate vulnerability and intentional climate adaptation responses on the ground. Next slide. So basically, you can think of adaptation planning and the adaptation workbook really as a filter, kind of a gut check on your overall management. In the end, our process is used to ensure that your goals and your objectives are robust and resilient to different risks and vulnerabilities. Custom plans developed using the adaptation workbook should reflect your values, but should ultimately complement and not replace existing management plans. Next slide. So why take the time to create an adaptation plan? It may feel like an extra step, but it is important and critical to that long-term effectiveness of our actions, given climate change and all of the risks and vulnerabilities that it presents. It has always been impossible to predict the future, and climate change makes that uncertainty even more apparent. But when we practice adaptive management, we're learning how to adjust and manage in the face of an uncertain future and all of those conditions that come along with it. And so by using a tool like the Adaptation Workbook, it really does help us clearly and intentionally tell our story, regardless of scale. All right, next slide. So we know that devising adaptation actions is super complex, and so we don't want to leave you hanging. Part of our process contains these helpful resources that can maybe be a place to creatively brainstorm potential actions. And we call these resources menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. And they really are designed to make sense of climate adaptation concepts like resilience, resistance, and transition as it relates to different disciplines of natural resource management. And really, they're meant to just ground the intentions of our on-the-ground actions with those big adaptation concepts. Next slide. The many menus of adaptation strategies and approaches shown here really support that flexibility in decision making and are the big ideas that also serve as, like I said, a great resource to brainstorm potential actions. We've collaborated with partners over the years to expand this set of resources beyond just forest, which we thought would be enough. That would be all that we ever did. But our partners who also take part in ecosystem management said, hey, we have a diversity of perspectives that is very relevant, and we want a tool too. So, we realized there is no one size fits all. And, if we wanted it to be a one size fits all, we would be doomed to fail. So what we've done is we've created these menus, which are a culmination of existing extensive literature review, a synthesis and a vetting by land managers and scientists, and they're all published and available online. You can find them at our web link there, and they will give you, they'll pump out the actual journal publication as well. So they are all peer reviewed. Each menu is different and encapsulates different perspectives from different lenses and topics like urban forests, recreation, or carbon. So like I said, there is no right way or wrong way to do this, and we do encourage mixing and matching of different topics. So what I want to do really quick is look at the forested watershed menu to get a sense of some of those big ideas and themes that are included within that particular menu. So next slide. We developed the Forested Watershed Adaptation Menu of strategies and approaches to help translate and connect those big adaptation concepts to principles that are relevant in forested watershed management. And so the menu, might be of particular interest to those managing riparian areas and ecosystems that are critical for water resources. But the menu itself really emphasizes ecosystem management that affects hydrology and water resources. Gets at sustaining water quality and yield, protection of aquatic habitat, managing for infrastructure. So some of the approaches that are included in the document are, taking steps to favor tree species that are expected to adapt, and alternatively disfavoring tree species that are distinctly maladapted. So that idea of transitioning forests, all the way to a whole slew of approaches related to accommodating a changing hydrology and promoting a more elastic system that can cope with the highs and the lows. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but please check out that publication on our website. Next slide. So in the end, I hope I've convinced you that some form of adaptation planning, maybe using our tool, the Adaptation Workbook, is a really critical and important step that we all need to be taking seriously as we're moving forward. And this process in particular takes that mystery and uncertainty right out of that planning, because it's completely clear and transparent and logical. And it sort of makes this whole idea of addressing climate change a more tangible concept. Next slide. Now, if you don't believe me or you want to learn about this yourself, you can go and check out all of the different stories of people who have used this tool to integrate climate change into their land management planning. And we have an awesome gallery and showcase of those stories and case studies on our website at forestadaptation.org/demos. You can find a diversity of perspectives and project level details describing how people are testing out new ideas and actions to respond to climate change. Next slide. This is the last one. Hopefully this run through of these big ideas got you interested in planning and integrating climate change into your site level project plans. And if that is the case, I would invite you to join us for our training. We are offering an online adaptation planning and practices training. It's free, it's interactive, but it is rigorous and a time commitment. We're going to ask you to come up with a real plan over 8 weeks of working with us. You will have access to all of my colleagues and I who provide, consultation and coaching as well. So you can register at the link on the bottom of the screen, forestadaptation.org/training. All right, next slide. And in closing, I just want to assure you that when we're thinking about climate change in our management, it really is the same job. It's just new challenges. And so you are the experts. You have a toolbox. We just need to be ready to adjust and modify those tools and how we're implementing them as challenges present themselves. Adaptation actions will always reflect who we are inherently. So we need not always compare what we would do versus what somebody else would do, because there is no one size fits all answer to all of this. But I would ask that you get started now. Be prepared to fail. It's totally okay. But please always tell your story and document your rationale. Okay, be in contact with me if you'd like. And thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Danielle. Does anyone have any questions? You have last parting we have about 1 minute for questions. Anyone has it? Okay, if not, just save it towards the end. I'd like to pass it over to Anne for the final presentation before the big wrap-up questions.
All right, thank you so much, Craig. So it's been a great setup with Katie and Danielle, because they've talked about all the stuff that we're trying to figure out how to be intentional with. So what I'd like to do today is just share some examples of how we're trying to be climate wise in our forest management. Next slide. So we are looking at a forest landscape with a lot of changes, including the climate. We have all the other effects of urbanization and globalization. I was really glad to hear a lot of people really, noting those changes in invasive species, because that is one of the big things that we are having to adapt our forest management to address. But it comes with the fragmentation, it comes with other fundamental changes in ecology. So we don't have our top predators on the landscape. We don't have our landscape scale fire. And we are looking at aging forests. I mean, we want to keep a healthy component of older forests on our landscape, but we also have to recognize that we want age diversity as well as species diversity and structural diversity. And we are seeing upticks in mortality, and a lot of the forest health issues that people were noting are coming hand in hand with some of that aging forest. If you look at our forest inventory and analysis data from U.S. Forest Service, the biggest cohort of trees now in our landscape is 80 to 100 years old. And a lot of people don't realize, how much of our landscape is starting to really get older, and we're getting into some of those aging issues. The bottom line for us is that if we want to keep some of our native species in this changed ecology, we need to figure out how to do good forest management, not just to figure out how is the right way to be cutting our trees and regenerating forests. And with the things that we've been learning in partnership with my co-presenters here is, how do you do that with the lens of climate change? A lot of our basic forest principles and practices of maintaining healthy density in the forest also help with drought resistance, but trying to be intentional, just as Danielle has said, helps us think it through even more. Next slide. So I wanted to share a few examples of where we've started to do this. A couple of them are watersheds and built on that adaptation menu that Danielle was sharing. And another is in Western Maryland State Forests. And then lastly, some of our more policy-oriented examples. Next slide. So the Baltimore City Reservoirs project is the one that we've really started with. We worked with the city to develop a forest management plan for their property in 2003. Some of the issues then were they had real issues with lack of regeneration from a lot of deer, and they've made progress on some of that since then. One of the overall goals was to transition some of those older plantations to more mixed native forests. When these reservoir forests were established, a lot of them was old field, and it got planted up into pine as the quickest way to capture it into forest function. So what we're working on right now is a update after 15 years, which is our normal cycle for forest management planning, to account for forest growth and death and all the other changes that happen over 15 years. And this effort is being supported through the U.S. Forest Service landscape scale competitive grants and a fairly broad partnership for this project, Adapting Mid-Atlantic Forests for Climate Change. So some of the partners are there below. It is Baltimore City Lands, located in Baltimore and Carroll counties. We're also, in addition to NIAX, the U.S. Forest Service, Northern Research Station, and some other partners from around the region. Next slide. So we started with learning. We've been doing forest management for a while, and we work with public and private forests. Can we go back a couple slides? There we go. So we had found the resources, and we had worked actually with Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and Patricia Leopold to do some of the risk assessments and that sort of thing. And so we had a workshop in January, thankfully, before all of the shutdowns. So we did get to do that one in person. We really had, like over 70 people on the first day to really share the learning of what does it look like to when you say you want to adapt forests for climate change. And then we had a day 2 with 5 teams where they started using the Adaptation Workbook. And so that's where a couple of these examples come from, is the outcome of that workshop. It is, you can see the recordings, some of the presentations, and some of that technical content is on that adaptation.org website. The next slide. So here's one of the pictures with Baltimore City Forests, and really highlighting our major issue with an invasive species and vines in particular. When we did the 2003 study, there was invasive species issues, but the forester at the time said, but the good news is it's mostly just on the edges, and the forest interior's pretty good. When we're looking at the forest now, 15 years later, we cannot say the same thing. There's been no harvesting. It's all just been the pattern that we're seeing under the current ecology, the level of fragmentation, the increased CO2 that seems to favor vines. Just all of these patterns are lining up. Some of those pine plantations that we had hoped to be able to do some mindful harvesting and transition, they just with procurement barriers and stuff, they did not get harvested. And we're really looking at some different options, fewer affordable options that we were hoping to use revenue that could have been generated from the pine plantations to address some of these growing invasive species issues in other parts that are probably less likely to get harvested. We're still, even with just our early results, data collection still underway going into next year. The lack of tree regeneration continues to be an issue, even though they expanded hunting into the Loch Raven Reservoir. There's so much unhunted land surrounding it that I think it's hard for them to do that on their properties. And there's an incredible diversity of invasive plants. One of the findings that the field crew wanted us to pass along was some of our oak stands. So it might tend to be some of the drier sites where they still had thick litter layers. They were not seeing the level of invasion that they're seeing in some other sites. I've mentioned the vines. Not only is it just one of many invasive plants, but it's a particular concern for trees. The Oriental bittersweet is a twining plant, gets up into the canopy. It makes it more susceptible to ice storm and windstorm damage, just because it, even in after the leaves have fallen off, you still have a lot of stuff up there that catches the ice and the wind in a different way. And so we see essentially premature death. And because it's 2020, we had an extra surprise. Our field crew, who is our forest health specialist and also on the Maryland Invasive Species Council, identified crazy worms. Like this is a real thing, Asian jumping worms. And the reservoirs have a lot of great recreational opportunities, including fishing. And they have been seeing, oh, somebody jumped to the crazy worms. Anyway, fishermen use all kinds of bait, and they very kindly throw it out into the bushes after they're done, so they don't have to unnecessarily kill any organisms. So we suspect that may be one point of entry for these worms, but the deal for watershed management and for climate adaptation and for susceptibility to other invasive plants is that it really eats up the litter layer, so it reduces the litter layer, and the soil ends up looking like coffee grounds. So if you see really fine, that kind of breaks up all the soil structure that otherwise is contributing to soil health and infiltration. So those are the issues that we're going to be working through that adaptation workbook as we go into recommendations on this site. Next slide. So one of the other places where we provide assistance with reservoir watershed management is on Frederick City. It was first done in 2005, and it's a real different site. So different land use history, different characteristics. Getting into the mountains, not just the Piedmont, and so it's got some different issues and some shared issues. So one of the issues that the group that was looking at the Frederick City management identified in the climate adaptation workshop was the conifer component. That was something of concern just even in the original plan, where they looked at the whole inventory and said, we don't have a whole lot of pine in here, and some of our historic pitch pine is declining because we've done a good job of fire suppression to protect the communities that live all around here. So you're also seeing a lot of gypsy moth historic damage on this property, and there is some invasive, just not the same level as what we see further down in Piedmont and Coastal Plain. Some of the dynamics we're looking at, not just trying to restore some species level diversity. We're trying to use prescribed fire and forest management to address the diversity and address drought resistance. A lot of times forest management, you're going in and you are trying to restore harvest enough trees out of there to leave well-spaced, individually vigorous trees as sort of the basis for a resilient approach. And climate adaptation, we have issues with a risk for periodic drought, more severe drought. And that same kind of strategy is going to help us have more drought resistance as well. The other thing that the fire is going to do is some of the species shift that we've been seeing under fire suppression and after the loss of some of the oaks with gypsy moth is just sort of a lot more black gum and red maple, that much more than was historically present. They're thin barked, they're not fire adapted the way the oaks are. Restoring fire to the extent that we can will also help us maintain a more historic native community. Next slide. So I just wanted to share some of the tools. You saw this in Danielle's presentation, but this is one of the things that when our managers were looking at the call to make sure we're doing a climate adaptation, they could look at the individual projections for tree species for their particular subregion, and say, what about what we were thinking of recommending is likely to work out with projected climate changes, and they don't have to work through all of the individual recommendations that is in the original research. The other thing that I want to make sure people keep in mind is this lays out winners and losers, but one of the things that we're going to be doing as we think about it, on putting it on the landscape, is not every site will it be losers. If we're looking at cove sites, if we're looking at northern aspects, there's diversity, just in that, microsites that can help us be resistant in some parts and resilient or, transitioning in other parts. Next slide. And this is one of the outcomes from the workshop. And so, we already went in with some expectation that we, wanted to manage for pitch pine, and had been able to work with the city of Frederick to start a prescribed burning program, which, from our perspective, back in 2005 is like a minor miracle, and is really a credit to the city staff and Jenny Willoughby, who understands the ecological goals we're after. But this whole exercise, I think, is really helping us be more intentional and realize some of the benefits and the other ways that we need to be thinking about our restoration, in addition to just species diversity. Next slide. And so I was really highlighting the, trying to retain the conifer, expand the conifer component, but an active part of what we're doing on the Frederick City watershed is managing invasives. And so they have, the city supports a DNR forester and technician to help map and treat invasive species. And one of the things that we've really tried to push this year has been ailanthus control, because it's the preferred host for the spotted lanternfly, which is a horrible pest for agricultural. Next slide. Okay, the last example and the biggest team that we had at the workshop was with our Western Maryland State Forests, and in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and their resilient forest effort. So overall goals out there are to build diversity, both of old growth and of young forests, and preserve some of those unique habitats, and using prescribed fire. Some of the issues they're seeing out there and that were discussed at the workshop was, we used to have really predictable frozen ground and snow cover that really helped with really low impact harvesting in the winter. And how do we manage with that with BMPs as that changes? That change in snow cover also has implications for water availability the next year, and makes the landscape a little more drought prone if you don't have that nice slow snow melt in the spring. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to highlight here was the partnership with the Nature Conservancy and our state forest managers. One of the things that they are moving forward with and acting on is really pursuing that late successional habitat, old growth. So I think I mentioned we have a lot of older trees in the landscape, a lot of 80 to 100-year-old trees, and that's true in our state forests as well. But what TNC is really taking the lead on doing is saying, well, how can we use forest management, ecological forest management, to maybe get to the old growth kind of conditions, the diversity, the structural diversity, some of those characteristics. How can we get there a little faster? So they are, they have just started this project, but this is the kind of things that they're looking at, how do we create more canopy gaps? There may be some tree seedling underplanting to increase species diversity. Are there, how many snags are there that would support, some of the other components of the ecosystem? Down woody debris. They said were finding a lot of snags in there, thanks to gypsy moths over the last couple of decades. And they're also looking for some of that species diversity and seeing that same declining conifers and pines, and trying to note where are big trees. They were saying they and the forest managers are finding more oak regeneration on dry sites and any places where you have good hunting pressure that can keep that deer browse down and allow the natural regeneration to get to that next stage above deer browse and get into be our next forest. Next slide. And of course, they also are actively managing invasives, mapping and treating. Their staff have the Dirty Dozen training on invasives. And next slide. So I just wanted to wrap up with a note of some of the policy things that are moving forward, and a lot of these are just starting. And the adaptation menus that NIAX has produced are a great resource here. And so a lot of these policy initiatives, climate resiliency planning at the local government level, the Maryland Department of Planning, salt intrusion report. We're just trying to do what we can to ensure that forests are considered just how we keep it over the landscape and over the life cycle of forests, and share a vision that we have a shifting mosaic of habitats and not just, one tree in one place. Next slide. And I just wanted to close with a note that we do have our Maryland Forest Action Plan open for comment. I'll put the link in the chat, but I want to reserve the rest of the time for any open questions.
Okay, well, thanks, Ann. That was very informative. We're now at 2:07, so I guess I'll turn it back to Katie for kind of the final Q&A and discussion.
Sure, thanks, Craig. Thanks, Ann and Danielle. Those are great presentations. So at this point, you can feel free to put in questions in the chat or in the Q&A pod if you have lingering questions that are remaining. But I did want to spend a little time kind of going to our discussion question, our final discussion question that we queued up in Slido. If you want to stop sharing, Marissa, I can share my screen and pull up some of the responses we've gotten so far. And I'm hoping my co-panelists here will join me in kind of looking at what folks have put in there and kind of reacting if there are things that are surprising. Here we go. You able to see that okay?
Yeah. Is it just a long list? I see 12 people have responded.
Yeah, we have 12 responses so far.
Nice.
So there's a lot of love for trees, which is good, but we probably have a little bit of a biased audience.
Well, that is, I was talking about a lot of the management stuff, but we are trying to have a whole range of tree planting programs, everything from Marylanders plant trees in your backyards, backyard buffers, all the way up to bigger plantings. The Chesapeake Bay Trust funded Healthy Forests, Healthy Waters. We just love having the resources to be able to help people get trees in the ground.
You do a great job at it.
Yeah, and related to the carbon sequestration idea here, for folks who are curious, in the Q&A pod, if you click that, you'll see a question from Laura, which we talked about, but you'll also see the links to some really interesting resources that can help you learn more about forest carbon policy and different programs.
Yeah, so we have a lot about trees and kind of the benefits of trees. There are also some good points about, the importance of maintaining habitats and habitat diversity. A comment on good management for fires, which is interesting. I think one of the things that surprised me was I don't see anything in here yet about invasive species management, considering how much that came up as a big concern. I found it a little surprising that no one's put that in there yet.
We sort of have to take it as a fact of life anymore.
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead, Ann.
When I started my forestry training in like 1982, this was not on the radar screen. Today, like their Penn State forestry program, it has a whole class on invasive species, and it's something where we're really having to adapt and learn. I've really appreciated Maryland Invasive Species Council and having that kind of network. One of the things that we get questions about is, are old trees, are young trees better for carbon sequestration? And so my answer is generally yes. So it's more, just like with species or age or structure, it's about diversity and not just, one thing is better than another. If you want to make the stock market analogy, our old growth are like our bonds for forest carbon. They have lots stored in there and it's very stable and not changing a whole lot. But they're not going to grow a whole lot either. If you want a growth strategy, you need some stocks, and that's your young trees. So, we need to pair our forest conservation with expansion of tree planting and managing some of our forests in ways that stimulate new growth.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think carbon storage and sequestration, I think, are often kind of used interchangeably, even though they're really different things. Our old forests store a lot of carbon, but in terms of like the rate at which carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere, it's lower. So yeah, I think that's a good point. But yeah, I think one of the challenging things with a lot of the carbon markets, which I know isn't the focus of this, but there seems to be some interest in the topic. But most of the carbon markets, the payments go for improved forest management, not for reforestation. And that's because it takes a while for your young trees to get big enough to actually be able to generate saleable credits for carbon. So it is a really great long-term strategy, but it takes so long, and the way that capitalism works isn't all that patient generally. So I think, the quick buck in carbon is improved forest management, even though, if you're thinking in the long term, planting new trees is a good investment. But there's some other good thoughts in here too that have come up about emphasizing the diversity of species, which is super important. I hope I didn't come across as promoting rushing out to buy Southern species. I was just mentioning that, that's something that we might be seeing, and we should be thinking about some of those transition strategies. Also, like the second, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, why not capitalize? Maryland really is at that transitional zone. And so it does make sense that you can try, you have a greater, maybe you have less risk to try something that does feel a little bit outside of your range because you can accommodate such a wider species matrix. Whereas when you're up in the Upper Peninsula, like I am of Michigan, in a boreal area, you have very different circumstances to work in. So Maryland is a great place to experiment.
Yeah, well, and that's sometimes where I've had a little harder time getting the attention of our foresters, because we're right in the mid of a lot of species range, and a lot of our species, if they say, oh, Georgia's climate is coming here, well, it's like, okay, well, we can keep these trees. But as we have had the warmer winters and as we have seen changes in rainfall intensity, we have to figure out how to manage with it. And and it looks like better BMPs, maybe a little more attention to our forest harvest BMPs, as well as really thoughtful consideration of, what are our recommendations, what new species might we introduce, or which of the species present do we favor in our management.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I see we're right at 2:15. I don't know if there are any last minute questions that came up, but we're happy to, if you put them into the Q&A pod, I'm happy to kind of take any final questions that come in. Also wanted to mention that we're going to try to compile some of the resources that people put forward together, or people put forward today, and compile them into something and hopefully get it up on Sched so we can share some of all the great lessons and advice that you all shared with us today. So I wanted to thank everyone for being so active in the conversation. We really appreciate all your participation. And yeah, here's the information for your next session. You can find them at Sched, and we'd love your feedback on the session. If you're able to offer a rating or provide comments, we'd be interested to hear that. So thanks everyone for joining.